March 13, 1931. Chicago. The Lexington Hotel. The radiator hissed steam into the corner office. Cigar smoke hung in the afternoon light filtering through bulletproof glass. And Alphonse Capone sat at a mahogany desk, fountain pen in hand, staring at a single sheet of paper that promised to make him untouchable. This is the true story of how America's most notorious gangster tried to buy his way into legitimacy, and how the very document he believed would save him became the evidence that destroyed him. By 1931, Al Capone controlled an empire worth over $100 million. He owned judges, politicians, and police captains. He'd survived assassination attempts, gang wars, and federal raids. But he couldn't survive something far simpler: the signature he placed on a tax return. This isn't about bootlegging or bullets. It's about power and the institutions designed to contain it. About the difference between being feared and being free. And about how the most dangerous moment in any criminal's life isn't the moment he rises to the top, it's the moment he believes he's already won. What happened in the spring of 1931 would change law enforcement forever. It would establish a precedent still used today. And it would prove that in America, there was one authority even Al Capone couldn't intimidate, bribe, or kill. Alphonse Gabriel Capone arrived in Chicago in 1920 as a 21-year-old enforcer with a scarred face and a talent for violence. Within 7 years, he controlled the city's entire bootlegging operation. The outfit, as his organization was called, generated an estimated $100 million annually, equivalent to nearly $2 billion in modern currency. He owned speakeasies, brothels, gambling houses, and legitimate businesses from laundries to bakeries. But Capone wanted more than money. He craved respectability. He donated to charities. He opened soup kitchens during the Depression, feeding thousands of unemployed men. He attended the opera and wore custom-tailored suits. He gave interviews portraying himself as a businessman simply providing services the public demanded. "I'm a businessman," he told reporters. "All I do is satisfy a public demand." The public was divided. To some, he was a Robin Hood figure. To others, a murderous thug. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, when 7 members of a rival gang were machine-gunned in a garage, had made him the most famous gangster in America. President Herbert Hoover personally demanded his prosecution, declaring, "I want that man in jail." But prosecuting Capone proved nearly impossible. Witnesses disappeared or refused to testify. Evidence vanished. Judges accepted bribes. Chicago's legal system belonged to him. By early 1931, however, the walls were closing in. Federal agents had been building cases for 2 years. Not for bootlegging or murder, crimes too difficult to prove, but for something simpler and more damaging: tax evasion. Capone had never filed a federal income tax return in his life.
All right, easy now.
On
Lower
March
it
13,
slow.
Capone's attorneys presented him with a solution. A way to make all
Watch
his
the left
legal
side.
problems disappear.
Keep it
But on this
steady.
day, everything was about to change. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Capone would voluntarily file income tax returns for the previous years, admitting to substantial earnings and paying back taxes. His legal team had negotiated informally with federal prosecutors. The understanding was simple: cooperate, pay what's owed, and the government would accept a plea deal resulting in minimal jail time, perhaps 2 years at most. Lawrence Mattingly, Capone's tax attorney, had crafted the approach carefully. The returns would acknowledge significant income without specifying its illegal sources. They would demonstrate good faith, transforming Capone from a tax evader into a responsible citizen making amends. It was, Mattingly assured him, the path to legitimacy. Capone sat in his Lexington Hotel headquarters on South Michigan Avenue, a fortress occupying 2 entire floors. Armed guards stood in the lobby. Steel doors sealed the private elevator. He'd survived here through countless threats, conducting business surrounded by bodyguards and bulletproof barriers. But paper was different than bullets. The document before him represented income of over $100,000 for 1929 alone, a staggering sum during the Depression, when most Americans earned less than $1,500 annually. Signing meant admitting to wealth he'd always publicly denied. It meant creating a permanent record. His attorney explained the mathematics. The back taxes, penalties, and interest would total approximately $50,000. A fortune, yes, but manageable. The alternative was prosecution resulting in decades of prison time. Sign now, accept the plea arrangement, serve perhaps 2 years in minimum security, then emerge still young enough to enjoy his empire. Capone had 3 men in the room. Mattingly, his tax lawyer. Murray Humphreys, his political fixer, and Jake Busick, his financial manager, a numbers genius who kept the outfit's complex accounting invisible. Busick was the only one who looked worried. Once it's signed, Busick said quietly, "It's testimony. It's evidence. It's your own words saying you earned this money." Mattingly dismissed the concern. "The arrangement is clear. We've been assured the government wants cooperation, not maximum prosecution. Mr. Capone pays what's owed, serves minimal time, and this ends." Assured by who? Busick asked. "Who put it in writing?" "The federal prosecutor's office doesn't make written promises in cases like this." "But the understanding." "Understanding," Busick repeated. The word hung in the cigar smoke. Capone signed. He placed his signature on tax returns for 1924 through 1929, acknowledging over $600,000 in taxable income, a sum that made him one of the wealthiest men in Chicago. The documents were filed with the Bureau of Internal Revenue on March 17, 1931. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then, on April 6, a federal grand jury in Chicago handed down an indictment. Not a plea arrangement, not a negotiated settlement, 23 counts of tax evasion, carrying a maximum sentence of 34 years in federal prison. The understanding Mattingly had relied upon didn't exist. Or rather, it existed only in the minds of Capone's attorneys. The federal prosecutors had never agreed to anything. They'd simply listened, said nothing to contradict the assumption, and waited for Capone to sign documents admitting to precisely the income they needed to prove their case. The tax returns weren't a path to freedom. They were a confession. When Capone learned of the indictment, he reportedly destroyed his office, overturning the mahogany desk, shattering glasses against the bulletproof windows. The same fountain pen he'd used to sign the returns lay on the floor among the wreckage. For the first time in a decade, Al Capone was genuinely afraid. The architect of Capone's downfall was a man most Americans had never heard of: Elmer Irey, chief of the Internal Revenue Service's Special Intelligence Unit. While FBI agents chased bootleggers and police battled gangsters on the streets, Irey worked in silence, assembling a case built entirely on numbers. Irey's strategy was revolutionary. Rather than proving Capone sold illegal alcohol, which required witnesses, physical evidence, and all the vulnerabilities of conventional prosecution, he would simply prove Capone spent money. Enormous amounts of money, money he'd never reported as income. The approach was called net worth prosecution. If a man owns 3 homes, drives custom automobiles, employs a staff of bodyguards, wears diamond jewelry, and maintains hotel suites costing hundreds of dollars weekly, yet reports zero income, then obviously, he's evading taxes. Irey's team fanned across Chicago, interviewing furniture dealers, jewelers, hotel clerks, and tailors. They documented every purchase, every payment, every transaction. They compiled lists of Capone's properties, his investments, his expenses. They built a financial profile demonstrating that between 1924 and 1929, Capone had spent over $1 million. The tax returns Capone filed in March gave them something even better: his own admission of income. Now they didn't have to estimate his earnings. He'd stated them himself, under oath, in his own handwriting. But Irey faced a problem. The case was unprecedented. No major criminal had ever been prosecuted primarily for tax evasion. Juries might view it as technical overreach, using tax law to punish crimes the government couldn't prove directly. The trial needed to feel legitimate, not like a legal trick. The solution came from an unexpected source. George E. Q. Johnson, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, decided to combine charges. In addition to the tax evasion indictment, a second indictment was filed in June: 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act, the federal prohibition law. Bootlegging charges, traditional crimes. The strategy was psychological. Present Capone is both a tax cheat and a gangster. Make the jury understand they weren't convicting him on a technicality, they were convicting a criminal who'd evaded every other form of justice. Capone's defense team scrambled. They filed motions to dismiss, arguing the tax returns had been filed voluntarily as part of settlement negotiations and couldn't be used as evidence against him. The motions were denied. They argued the government's net worth calculations were speculative and unreliable. The judge allowed them as evidence. In September, they attempted one final strategy: bribery. According to federal agents who monitored Capone's organization, approximately $10,000 was distributed to individuals connected to the jury pool. Names and addresses of potential jurors were obtained through Capone's network of court clerks and city officials. The money was delivered by intermediaries, accompanied by simple messages: remember who your friends are. What happened next took 17 minutes. On the morning of October 6, 1931, the day the trial was scheduled to begin, Judge James Herbert Wilkerson entered his courtroom at the Federal Building in downtown Chicago. The gallery was packed with reporters, federal agents, and spectators. Capone sat at the defense table in a yellow suit and white fedora, projecting confidence. His attorneys shuffled papers, prepared to begin jury selection. Wilkerson looked at the crowded room and made an announcement that changed everything. He was switching jury pools with another judge. The jury panel seated in his courtroom, the panel Capone had spent weeks bribing, would be sent to another trial. A different panel, from a different case, with different names Capone's organization didn't have, would hear the Capone case instead. The decision was announced casually, as a routine administrative matter. But everyone understood what it meant. Capone's face went pale. His attorneys requested an immediate recess. Wilkerson denied it. Jury selection would begin immediately, with the new panel, from the new list, composed of names nobody in Capone's organization had ever seen. The millions of dollars Capone had spent on bribes were worthless. The trial lasted 11 days. Prosecutor Johnson presented a case built on mathematics and documentation, receipts, ledgers, testimony from shopkeepers and hotel managers. A financial mosaic proving that Capone had spent vast sums despite reporting zero income. The defense argued that spending money wasn't the same as earning it. Perhaps Capone had borrowed the funds. Perhaps they were gifts. Perhaps the government's calculations were simply wrong. Then the prosecution introduced Capone's own tax returns, the documents he'd signed in March, admitting to over $600,000 in income. The courtroom went silent. Defense attorney Michael Ahern stood and objected. Those returns, he argued, were filed as part of settlement negotiations. They were inadmissible. Using them as evidence violated the spirit of negotiation itself. Judge Wilkerson disagreed. The returns were voluntary disclosures filed with the Bureau of Internal Revenue. They were official documents. They were admissible. Ahern then made a critical decision. He put Capone on the stand. It was an act of desperation. Capone was a commanding presence in private, but courtroom testimony required precision and restraint, qualities he didn't possess. Under cross-examination, he grew defensive and evasive. When asked about specific expenditures, he claimed not to remember. When pressed about the source of his income, he gave vague answers about gambling winnings and business ventures he couldn't name. Prosecutor Johnson methodically dismantled each claim. He presented evidence of specific purchases Capone had denied. He showed receipts bearing Capone's signature. He demonstrated, line by line, that Capone's testimony contradicted his own tax returns, the documents he'd filed under oath just 7 months earlier. The jury watched Capone contradict himself repeatedly. They saw him caught between two impossible positions: admit the money came from bootlegging, or admit the tax returns he'd filed were fraudulent. On October 17, after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned verdicts on both indictments. On the Prohibition charges, they acquitted Capone of most counts. The evidence was too circumstantial, too dependent on testimony from criminals themselves. But on the tax evasion charges, they convicted him on 5 counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters sprinted for telephones. Capone sat motionless, his face expressionless, his hands folded on the table before him. On October 24, Judge Wilkerson delivered the sentence: 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion. $50,000 in fines. $30,000 in court costs. And immediate imprisonment, no bail pending appeal. Capone stood as the sentence was read. His yellow suit, so confident 11 days earlier, now seemed garish and ridiculous. His attorneys whispered urgently, preparing appeals that would ultimately fail. U.S. Marshals approached. One carried handcuffs. For a moment, Capone looked at the courtroom, at the reporters, the spectators, the federal agents who'd pursued him for years. He'd controlled this city. He'd owned its officials and terrified its citizens. He'd built an empire that seemed invincible. Then the handcuffs clicked shut. The appeal process consumed 8 months. Capone's attorneys argued the sentence was excessive, the evidence was circumstantial, the use of his own tax returns violated his constitutional rights against self-incrimination. In May 1932, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals rejected every argument. The conviction stood. The sentence stood. On May 4, 1932, Capone was transferred from Cook County Jail to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. He traveled in a private railcar, accompanied by U.S. Marshals and pursued by photographers at every station. The man who'd once moved through Chicago in bulletproof limousines now rode in chains. Atlanta was different than county jail. Federal prison meant structure, discipline, and isolation. Capone attempted to recreate his old privileges, bribing guards, securing special accommodations, maintaining communication with his organization in Chicago. Some guards accepted money, others reported him. In August 1934, he was transferred again. This time to a new facility designed specifically for inmates like him, criminals whose wealth and connections made standard prisons inadequate. Alcatraz Island, The Rock, 1.5 miles offshore in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by frigid water and lethal currents. A prison where inmates were identified by numbers, not names. Where communication with the outside was limited to 1 letter per week and 1 visit per month. Where guards were rotated regularly to prevent bribery and corruption. Capone became inmate 85. His money meant nothing. His reputation meant nothing. The guards didn't fear him, and they couldn't be bought. For the first time since adolescence, Alphonse Capone had no power whatsoever. He spent 4.5 years at Alcatraz. During that time, his empire in Chicago collapsed. Without his leadership, the outfit fractured into competing factions. His political connections dissolved. His legitimate businesses were sold or seized. The soup kitchens closed. The donations ended. More devastating than the loss of power was the loss of his mind. By 1938, untreated syphilis contracted decades earlier began destroying his brain. He suffered seizures, confusion, and memory loss. He spent hours in his cell playing the banjo, often forgetting where he was or why. In January 1939, he was released from Alcatraz and transferred to Terminal Island Prison in California to serve the remainder of his sentence. In November 1939, he was released entirely, 8 years of an 11-year sentence, with time off for good behavior. He returned to his estate in Palm Island, Florida. 39 years old, wealthy but powerless, famous but irrelevant, his mind deteriorating daily. The man who'd once controlled Chicago spent his final years in Florida, increasingly unable to recognize his own family. He fished. He sat on his dock watching the water. He played cards with former associates who visited occasionally, out of loyalty or curiosity. In 1946, his physician diagnosed him with tertiary syphilis, the final stage, when the disease destroys the brain and nervous system. Treatment options were limited and largely ineffective. The infection had progressed too far. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. He briefly recovered consciousness, surrounded by family members. According to those present, he spoke a few words in Italian, phrases about his mother, about Chicago, about things no one quite understood. On January 25, he suffered cardiac arrest. He died at 7:25 in the evening, surrounded by family but alone in the ruined landscape of his mind. He was 48 years old. The news made front pages across America, but the headlines were smaller than they would have been a decade earlier. The story wasn't about a criminal mastermind or a dramatic fall from power. It was about a sick man who died in Florida. The narrative had already ended years before, in a courtroom in Chicago, when handcuffs closed around his wrists. The empire he'd built lasted less than 15 years. The precedent his prosecution established has endured for nearly a century. In the days after his death, newspapers published retrospectives examining his life and legacy. Most focused on the violence, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the gang wars, the corruption. Few mentioned the real lesson of his downfall. Al Capone wasn't defeated by better criminals or braver police. He was defeated by accountants and tax lawyers. By patient investigators who assembled financial records while bullets flew in the streets. By a legal system that discovered something crucial: institutions are more powerful than individuals, no matter how fearsome those individuals appear. The tax evasion strategy pioneered against Capone became standard practice. Mobsters who survived machine gun ambushes were imprisoned for unpaid taxes. Drug traffickers who evaded narcotics charges were convicted on financial crimes. The precedent transformed law enforcement, establishing that the most effective weapon against organized crime wasn't force, it was bureaucracy. Murray Humphreys, Capone's political fixer, continued operating in Chicago until his death in 1965. Jake Busick, the financial genius who'd warned against signing the tax returns, remained influential in the outfit until 1956. Both men filed tax returns religiously, reporting income and paying taxes on their criminal earnings. They'd learned the lesson Capone never did. The Lexington Hotel, Capone's fortress headquarters, was demolished in 1995. Federal investigators searched the site for hidden vaults supposedly containing cash and evidence. They found nothing but empty rooms and abandoned furniture. Power, in the end, is about more than control or fear. It's about understanding the systems that contain you. Capone controlled Chicago, but he never understood the system he existed within. He believed wealth and violence made him untouchable. He learned, too late, that in America there are structures more powerful than any individual, structures that can't be intimidated, bribed, or killed. On March 13, 1931, he sat in his bulletproof office and signed his name to a document he believed would save him. The fountain pen moved across paper, ink forming letters that spelled his own defeat. He thought he was buying legitimacy. He was signing a confession. And somewhere in Washington, in an office far from Chicago's violence, an accountant filed the papers away and closed the case.